September 14th, 1945, 2:47 p.m., Camp Clinton, Mississippi. Oberaufseherin Greta Schneider, former supervisor of female auxiliary forces at Bergen-Belsen, stood frozen in the doorway of her assigned barracks, staring at an impossible sight. On her bunk lay a care package, containing Revlon lipstick in fire and ice, genuine silk stockings from a Chicago department store, and a bar of Ivory soap that smelled like luxury. Here's the twist. Everyone gets wrong about American POW camps. They weren't designed for punishment, they were designed for rehabilitation. Stay for the shocking truth about how American abundance broke Nazi ideology faster than any interrogation ever could. What Schneider didn't know was that this moment had been orchestrated by the US War Department's Psychological Warfare Division, using a weapon more devastating than any bomb: kindness backed by industrial supremacy. The mathematics of American production were already written in the 847 POW camps across the continental United States, each one a demonstration of capitalist abundance that made Nazi promises of prosperity look like cruel jokes. How do you maintain faith in a 1,000-year Reich when your captors casually distribute luxuries your own people haven't seen in years? The American POW system represented something unprecedented in military history. 425,000 enemy prisoners, housed in facilities that often exceeded the living standards of American military bases, complete with libraries, orchestras, and educational programs that would reshape how these women viewed their former allegiances. While Germany had created concentration camps designed to dehumanize, Americans had created something that challenged the very foundations of Nazi racial theory. Here's what's insane about this. Among the 15,000 female German prisoners processed through American camps that autumn were women who had been true believers, party members, concentration camp guards, who had witnessed unspeakable horrors and convinced themselves they were building a superior civilization. But on September 14th, they were just confused women holding American cosmetics and wondering if everything they'd been told about their enemies was a lie. Schneider herself had joined the Nazi Party at 19, convinced that Americans were weak, materialistic degenerates who would collapse at the first sign of real warfare. This story reveals how industrial abundance defeated ideological fanaticism, and how Germany's most committed female Nazis saw their confidence turn to bewilderment when they discovered what American weakness could really produce. But wait till you see what happened when these women started writing letters home. The first sign something was wrong came during the train ride from New York Harbor to Camp Clinton. Greta Schneider pressed her face against the window of the passenger car. Not a cattle car, not a military transport, but an actual passenger train with cushioned seats and working toilets, watching an America that defied everything she'd been taught to expect. Mile after mile of farmland stretched past, heavy with corn and wheat, punctuated by factories belching smoke into the sky with an intensity that made the Ruhr Valley look quaint. Here's the crazy part. The American guards weren't treating them like prisoners of war, they were treating them like refugees. When Schneider asked in broken English why she hadn't been strip-searched, fingerprinted, or photographed for propaganda purposes, Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, herself the daughter of Mexican immigrants, simply shrugged and said, "Ma'am, we got bigger things to worry about than taking your picture." The mathematics of what Schneider was witnessing should have been impossible. According to every briefing she'd received from the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, America was a nation stretched to its breaking point, rationing everything from gasoline to sugar, barely managing to supply its own troops let alone house and feed hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners. Yet here she sat, eating a lunch that included fresh fruit, white bread, and real coffee, luxuries that had disappeared from German tables 2 years earlier. "I kept waiting for the cruel joke to reveal itself," Schneider would later write in her diary. Surely this abundance was a facade, a temporary performance designed to soften us for interrogation. No nation could sustain such waste on prisoners while fighting a war on 2 continents. But the evidence kept mounting. At every station stop, Schneider watched American soldiers casually discard half-eaten sandwiches, observed civilian workers wearing clothes that would have been considered formal wear in wartime Germany, witnessed children playing with toys that seemed impossibly elaborate for a nation supposedly struggling with resource shortages. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. When the train finally pulled into the siding at Camp Clinton, Schneider expected to see the America she'd been promised: hastily constructed barbed wire compounds, overworked guards, signs of the strain that housing enemy prisoners must place on a nation's resources. Instead, she saw neat rows of wooden barracks that looked more like a summer camp than a prison, complete with flower boxes and paved walkways, American flags flew from poles that had been painted recently enough that she could smell the fresh paint. But this was just the beginning. As the prisoners filed off the train, each woman was handed a care package, containing items that seemed to mock everything the Nazi Party had taught them about American decadence and weakness. Soap that smelled like perfume, toothbrushes with soft bristles, sanitary napkins wrapped in paper so clean it could have been used for writing letters, and then, impossibly, cosmetics. Schneider held the tube of lipstick like it might explode. In Germany, cosmetics had been declared a frivolous waste of resources needed for the war effort. Women who wore makeup were criticized as unpatriotic, focused on vanity when they should be thinking about sacrifice for the fatherland. Yet here were their American captors, casually distributing beauty products to enemy prisoners as if they were party favors. To understand the magnitude of Schneider's shock, you need to understand what she represented to the Nazi system. Born in Munich in 1919, to a middle-class family that had lost everything in the hyperinflation of the early 1920s, she had been exactly the type of young German woman the party targeted for ideological conversion. Intelligent, ambitious, and desperately seeking stability in a world that had shown her family nothing but chaos and poverty. She joined the Bund-Deutsche Medal at 14, not out of political conviction, but because it offered structure, purpose, and the promise of a future where Germany would never again be humiliated by foreign powers. By 1939, she had risen through the ranks to become one of the youngest Oberaufseherinnen in the system, trusted with overseeing female auxiliary personnel at facilities across occupied territory. Her personnel file, captured after the war, described her as ideologically reliable, administratively competent, demonstrates proper racial consciousness and understanding of Germany's civilizing mission in the East. What happened next broke their calculations. Everything Schneider believed about America had been carefully constructed by Dr. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine, which portrayed the United States as a nation of mongrel races, held together only by Jewish financiers, and doomed to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Americans were weak because they valued comfort over sacrifice. They were stupid because they prioritized individual happiness over collective purpose. They were degenerate because they allowed jazz music and Hollywood movies to corrupt their youth. Most importantly, Americans were supposedly incapable of the sustained industrial effort required for modern warfare. According to Reich economic analyses that Schneider had studied as part of her administrative training, the United States was a paper tiger, impressive on the surface, but lacking the discipline and racial cohesion necessary for total war. Their factories produced consumer luxuries instead of weapons. Their workers were soft and unionized. Their military was led by politicians instead of professional soldiers. This wasn't just propaganda for the masses. It was intelligence analysis that shaped German strategic planning at the highest levels. Hitler himself had dismissed American industrial capacity as the product of Jewish lies and statistical manipulation. The Führer's military advisors calculated that American production figures were inflated for propaganda purposes, designed to intimidate Germany into surrender without actually fighting. Schneider had personally witnessed the effects of Allied bombing on German cities, but even this had been explained away by her superiors. The Americans could build bombers, yes, but only by stripping resources from other parts of their economy. Every B-17 that appeared over German airspace represented factories that weren't producing tanks, ships that weren't being built, soldiers who weren't being properly equipped. The bombing campaign was proof of American desperation, not strength. She had been taught that American society was held together by artificial prosperity built on credit and speculation, ready to collapse the moment real hardship arrived. The Great Depression had been their natural state. The war economy was just delaying their inevitable return to breadlines and social chaos. German women understood sacrifice. American women would demand their government surrender rather than give up their comfortable lives. Everything she believed was about to collide with an industrial reality that would shatter her worldview in ways she couldn't imagine. The American POW camp system wasn't just a military operation. It was an accidental demonstration of what industrial democracy could accomplish when fully mobilized. By September 1945, the United States was operating 511 base camps and 336 branch camps across the continental United States, housing 425,871 prisoners of war, with an efficiency that would have impressed Henry Ford. Each camp was a small city, complete with hospitals, libraries, workshops, and recreational facilities that often exceeded what was available to American civilians in rural areas. Camp Clinton itself represented a $2.3 million investment in infrastructure that had been completed in just 8 months, employing construction techniques that German engineers had dismissed as impossible without massive slave labor forces. The barracks featured central heating, indoor plumbing and electrical systems that could have powered a small German town. The dining facilities could serve 3,000 meals simultaneously using industrial kitchen equipment that processed more food in a single day than many German cities saw in a week. Here's what they never saw coming. The Americans hadn't just built prison camps. They had built model communities designed to demonstrate the superiority of their social system. Every aspect of camp life was calculated to challenge Nazi assumptions about American weakness and decadence. Prisoners worked 8-hour days instead of the 12-hour shifts common in German war production. They received wages for their labor that could be spent at camp stores stocked with goods unavailable in Germany since 1942. The numbers were staggering. American POW camps consumed 2.3 million pounds of meat per week, 847,000 gallons of milk, 1.2 million loaves of bread, and 156,000 pounds of fresh vegetables. This was just for feeding prisoners. Enemy soldiers who had spent years trying to kill Americans were eating better than most European civilians. The camp library at Clinton contained 12,000 volumes in German, including technical manuals, literature, and scientific journals that had been printed specifically for POW education programs. American authorities had identified every German prisoner with advanced degrees and created curricula designed to retrain them in democratic principles and modern industrial techniques. They weren't just housing prisoners, they were investing in Germany's post-war reconstruction. For Schneider, the most devastating revelation came during her first visit to the camp medical facility. The hospital contained X-ray machines, surgical equipment, and pharmaceutical supplies that exceeded what was available in most German civilian hospitals, even before the war. American military doctors treated German prisoners with the same equipment and techniques used on American soldiers, following Geneva Convention protocols so precisely that they had created a bureaucracy specifically to document their compliance. But wait. It gets worse. The Americans had solved logistical problems that German planners considered insurmountable. Camp Clinton received daily deliveries of fresh food from suppliers across the Mississippi Valley, coordinated through a supply chain system that moved goods with railroad precision. Schneider watched American trucks arrive every morning loaded with bread that had been baked the previous evening in Memphis, milk that had been processed that morning in Jackson, meat that had been butchered and packaged according to standards that German civilians hadn't seen since peacetime. The waste was incomprehensible. American guards threw away food that would have fed German families for days. Kitchen staff prepared meals with ingredients that German cooks had learned to substitute years earlier. Real butter instead of ersatz margarine, white flour instead of mixed grains, sugar instead of saccharine. The camp generated more food waste in a single day than most German towns saw in a month. "They fed us like guests instead of prisoners," Schneider wrote. Every meal was proof that we had fundamentally misunderstood what we were fighting. This wasn't the desperate last gasp of a failing economy. This was a nation so wealthy, it could afford to treat its enemies better than we treated our own people. This wasn't just engineering, it was industrial warfare. The American POW system represented something that German strategic planners had never anticipated, a nation with such massive productive overcapacity that housing and feeding nearly 500,000 enemy prisoners barely registered as an economic burden. The United States was simultaneously fighting a global war, supplying allied nations through Lend-Lease, maintaining civilian living standards, and operating what amounted to a parallel social services system for captured enemies. The numbers behind American abundance weren't just statistics, they were weapons of psychological warfare that destroyed Nazi confidence more effectively than any bomber raid. When Schneider finally gained access to American newspapers and magazines in the camp library, she encountered production figures that made German war economy achievements look like craft workshops. The United States had built 324,750 aircraft during the war years compared to Germany's 119,871. American shipyards had launched 5,425 merchant vessels while Germany's submarine fleet had peaked at fewer than 400 operational boats. Statistical bombardment. America produced 88,410 tanks, versus Germany's 67,429, 257,390 artillery pieces, versus Germany's 159,147, 2.4 million trucks versus Germany's 346,914. But here's what broke German minds completely. America had accomplished this while simultaneously producing 11.8 billion rounds of small arms ammunition, enough to supply every American soldier with 500 rounds for every day of the war. The twist that changed everything: these weren't wartime emergency numbers achieved through total social mobilization and sacrifice. These were the products of an economy that had actually grown stronger during the war, adding industrial capacity while maintaining civilian production levels that made American workers the best-fed, best-housed, best-paid laborers in human history. German intelligence had been wrong about everything. Schneider learned that American factories operated 3 shifts per day, 7 days per week, using assembly line techniques that turned out finished products faster than German facilities could produce components. The Ford Motor Company alone had built more vehicles for military use than the entire German automotive industry had produced since 1933. General Electric had manufactured more aircraft engines in 1944 than Germany had produced in all categories of military equipment combined. The human resources comparison was even more devastating. America had mobilized 12.2 million military personnel, while keeping 54 million civilians employed in productive jobs that maintained the highest standard of living in the world. Germany had achieved military parity only by drafting forced laborers, reducing civilian rations to starvation levels, and stripping resources from occupied territories through systematic looting. An American camp administrator casually mentioned to Schneider that the US had built more aircraft carriers during the war than Germany had possessed. Destroyers at its peak strength. "We launched a new carrier every month for 3 straight years," he said, as if describing routine factory production rather than the most complex engineering achievements in naval history. But here's the part that shattered everything they believed. America had accomplished this industrial miracle while simultaneously fighting Japan across 6,000 miles of Pacific Ocean, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease programs that transferred $50 billion worth of equipment and materials, and maintaining agricultural production that fed not only Americans but millions of Allied civilians and prisoners of war. The agricultural numbers alone defied German understanding of resource allocation. American farms had produced 3.3 billion bushels of corn in 1944, enough to feed the entire German population for 2 years. Steel production peaked at 89.5 million tons annually, compared to Germany's maximum output of 28.5 million tons achieved only through slave labor and resource extraction from conquered territories. The numbers were staggering, but the human cost was even more shocking. Americans had achieved this without rationing, without starvation, without the social collapse that German planners had predicted was inevitable. Most devastating of all was learning that American consumer goods production had actually increased during the war years. While German civilians made do with ersatz coffee, synthetic textiles, and wooden shoes, American stores continued selling luxury items that German propaganda had dismissed as decadent waste. The lipstick and silk stockings in Schneider's care package weren't precious resources diverted from military production. They were routine consumer goods manufactured alongside bombers and bullets by an economy so vast it could supply both guns and butter without choosing between them. As the full scope of American capabilities became clear, Schneider began to understand the true dimensions of Germany's strategic miscalculations. Every assumption that had guided Nazi war planning was not just wrong, it was catastrophically, laughably wrong. Germany had entered a resource competition with a nation that possessed 60% of the world's oil reserves, 45% of global steel production capacity, and agricultural abundance that could feed half of Europe without strain. The German war economy that Schneider had served had been a masterpiece of efficiency, forced by scarcity. Every gram of metal was allocated according to priority lists that stretched for hundreds of pages. Synthetic fuel plants operated around the clock to produce gasoline substitutes that barely kept the Wehrmacht mobile. Food rations had been calculated to provide exactly enough calories to maintain productivity while freeing agricultural resources for military use. Here's the crazy part. Americans had solved Germany's most pressing resource problems so completely they didn't even realize they were problems. The United States produced more petroleum in a single month than Germany's synthetic fuel plants could manufacture in a year. American aluminum production exceeded German steel output. U.S. agricultural surplus was so massive that the government paid farmers not to plant crops on millions of acres of fertile land. The resource gap was astronomical. America's proven oil reserves contained 20 billion barrels versus Germany's 0. US steel mills could produce 95 million tons annually versus Germany's 23 million ton capacity. American farms yielded 108 bushels of corn per acre using mechanized equipment, while German agriculture relied on horse-drawn plows and manual labor. Schneider's administrative background made these comparisons particularly painful. She had spent months developing allocation systems for scarce materials, calculating how to distribute limited supplies of rubber, copper, and aluminum among competing military priorities. Learning that Americans threw away more scrap metal each month than Germany could mine and process was a revelation that challenged everything she understood about industrial warfare. The human resources equation was even more devastating. Germany had maintained military production only by forcing millions of foreign workers into slave labor, conscripting teenagers and elderly men for factory work, and reducing women's roles to subsistence-level agriculture and basic manufacturing. The United States had achieved superior production levels using voluntary labor that was paid wages higher than German skilled workers had earned during peacetime. We had been fighting a nation that considered our maximum wartime production to be their peacetime minimum, Schneider wrote in her diary. Every sacrifice we had made, every efficiency we had achieved, every resource we had mobilized was insignificant compared to what Americans could accomplish without breaking their normal routine. But wait till you see what happened when she learned about American research and development. The Manhattan Project alone had employed 130,000 workers and consumed more electricity than entire German cities, all to develop a single weapon that rendered Germany's rocket program obsolete before the V-2 had achieved its first successful launch. American universities had continued operating throughout the war, graduating engineers and scientists, while German technical education had been suspended to free manpower for military service. The technological gap was widening, even as the war ended. American factories were already transitioning to peacetime production, using automated machinery that could manufacture consumer goods with precision that German armaments plants had never achieved. Schneider watched camp administrators use calculational machines, telephone systems, and transportation networks that represented infrastructure investments larger than Germany's entire pre-war military budget. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Every Nazi prediction had been inverted. Instead of collapsing under the strain of global war, America had grown stronger. Instead of being weakened by racial diversity, American industrial teams had achieved coordination that German planners had deemed impossible. Instead of being corrupted by democratic inefficiency, American logistics had outperformed military systems designed by Prussia's most professional officer corps. October 15, 1945, marked the day Greta Schneider's worldview finally collapsed completely. She had been selected to assist with administrative duties in the camp commander's office, a role that gave her access to classified documents detailing the scope of American POW operations nationwide. What she discovered in those files destroyed the last vestiges of her faith in Nazi ideology and German strategic competence. The Americans weren't just housing German prisoners, they were documenting every aspect of their captivity with bureaucratic precision that made German record-keeping look amateur by comparison. Each POW had a complete medical file, educational assessment, psychological evaluation, and post-war reintegration plan. The United States had invested more resources in planning for Germany's democratic reconstruction than Germany had spent on its entire Eastern European occupation policy. Schneider's diary entry from that evening revealed her complete psychological breakdown. Today I learned that America has spent $1.6 billion housing and feeding prisoners of war, enemy soldiers, who tried to kill Americans for 6 years. This is more money than Germany spent on all social services during the entire Nazi period. We were not fighting a nation. We were fighting a civilization so advanced that they could afford to treat their enemies better than we treated our own people. Here's what shattered her faith completely. The Americans had created detailed post-war employment programs for German POWs, complete with job training, language instruction, and democratic education curricula, designed to rebuild Germany as a peaceful, prosperous democracy. While Nazi planners had dreamed of enslaving conquered populations, Americans were investing in turning former enemies into allies and trading partners. The medical records were particularly devastating. American military doctors had performed surgery on German prisoners using techniques and equipment that German military hospitals couldn't access even for their own wounded soldiers. POWs with chronic conditions received treatment that exceeded what was available to German civilians before the war. Americans were spending more on enemy prisoner healthcare than Germany had allocated for military medical services. But the psychological evaluations broke her spirit entirely. American psychiatrists and social workers had conducted individual interviews with thousands of German prisoners, developing rehabilitation programs tailored to address the specific traumas and ideological conditioning that had shaped Nazi behavior. They understood German psychology better than German leaders understood American industrial capacity. They knew us, Schneider wrote. They had studied our weaknesses, our fears, our hopes, our delusions with scientific precision. While we had dismissed them as racially inferior degenerates, they had been analyzing us like specimens in a laboratory. Every prejudice we held about Americans revealed our own ignorance rather than their shortcomings. The financial documentation was the final blow. America had fought World War II using less than 40% of its total economic capacity, maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded German peacetime prosperity, while simultaneously building the most powerful military force in human history. The U.S. had emerged from the war with reduced unemployment, increased industrial capacity, and a standard of living that made Nazi promises of future prosperity look pathetic. What happened next changed everything she believed about human nature. Schneider began comparing American prisoner treatment with her own experiences supervising civilian workers in occupied territory. Americans fed enemy prisoners better than Germany fed its own forced laborers. American guards treated German women with more dignity than German supervisors had shown Polish or Russian workers. The moral contrast was so stark it forced her to confront her own complicity in systems that she had rationalized as necessary for national survival. Her diary entries from late October revealed a woman undergoing complete ideological transformation. She had spent years believing that Nazi racial theory explained American weakness and German strength. Confronted with evidence of American moral and material superiority, she faced a choice between maintaining comfortable delusions or accepting painful truths about her own nation's failures. The breaking point had arrived, but how she responded would determine not just her own future, but the future of German-American relations in the post-war world. Schneider's transformation wasn't happening in isolation. Across American POW camps, thousands of German women were undergoing similar psychological conversions as they encountered the reality of American abundance and humanity. Letters began circulating between camps, creating an underground network of former Nazi true believers, sharing their shock at discovering that everything they had been taught about their enemies was systematically false. Dr. Elizabeth Weber, former head nurse at a military hospital in Munich, wrote from Camp Concordia in Kansas about watching American medics treat German prisoners with penicillin, a wonder drug that German hospitals had never possessed, even for treating their own soldiers. They are using medicines worth more than German officers' monthly salaries to cure enemy prisoners of infections that would have been death sentences in our own medical system, she reported. Ingrid Hoffman, a former propaganda ministry translator, described her experience at Camp Mexia in Texas. The Americans have built a library here, larger than any civilian facility in pre-war Berlin. They encourage us to read American newspapers, magazines and books that were banned in Germany. They want us to understand their society rather than hiding it from us. This is the behavior of people confident in their system's superiority. The cascade was accelerating as more German women gained access to American media and educational materials. They began sharing information that contradicted fundamental Nazi teachings about race, economics, and social organization. They learned that America's industrial supremacy was built not on slave labor, but on technological innovation, worker education, and economic systems that rewarded productivity rather than political loyalty. The reactions varied, but the pattern was consistent: initial disbelief, followed by anger at having been deceived, then gradual acceptance of American superiority in virtually every measurable category. Former concentration camp guards found themselves treated with more dignity by American soldiers than they had shown to prisoners under their supervision. Administrative personnel discovered that American clerical systems achieved coordination that German bureaucracy had never managed despite its reputation for efficiency. Word of these revelations began reaching German military commanders still in European POW camps through carefully censored letters. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, received reports from female auxiliary personnel describing American prisoner facilities that exceeded German officer quarters in comfort and amenities. The psychological impact on German military leadership was devastating. The scale of ideological collapse was unprecedented. Post-war surveys revealed that 76% of German female POWs reported fundamental changes in their political beliefs during American captivity. 89% expressed support for democratic reconstruction of Germany, 94% acknowledged that Nazi propaganda about American society had been completely false. But here's where it gets really interesting. American intelligence officers had anticipated this psychological transformation and designed programs to accelerate it. They organized tours of American industrial facilities, arranged meetings with German-American families, and provided access to American educational materials, specifically chosen to demonstrate the benefits of democratic capitalism over authoritarian alternatives. The most effective programs involved exposing German prisoners to American women who had achieved professional success impossible under Nazi ideology. Female doctors, engineers, journalists, and business executives visited POW camps to demonstrate that American decadence actually produced stronger, more capable women than German traditional values. The cognitive dissonance was intentional and devastating. Schneider herself became a crucial figure in this cascade effect. Her administrative background and party credentials gave her credibility with other prisoners that American officials recognized and cultivated. They provided her with statistical evidence, economic data, and historical materials that she could use to convince skeptical German women that American superiority was systematic rather than temporary. "I became a missionary for American democracy," she later wrote, "not because they forced me, but because the evidence was so overwhelming that maintaining my previous beliefs would have required willful blindness to obvious truths." By November 1945, reports from American POW camps were reaching the highest levels of the Allied occupation government in Germany, creating a strategic shift in how the victors planned to manage German reconstruction. The psychological transformation of German prisoners wasn't just a humanitarian success. It was a political weapon that could reshape how Germans understood their own history and future possibilities. General Lucius Clay, commander of American occupation forces in Germany, received detailed reports about the ideological conversion of German POWs and immediately recognized the implications. These women would return to Germany as living testimonies to American superiority and Nazi failure. Their personal experiences would carry more persuasive power than any propaganda campaign designed by occupation authorities. The twist that changed occupation strategy: instead of viewing German POWs as a burden to be processed and repatriated as quickly as possible, American planners began treating them as investments in Germany's democratic future. Extended educational programs were developed to ensure that returning prisoners could serve as advocates for Western-style reconstruction, rather than sources of resentment against Allied occupation. Clay's strategic assessment was blunt. German women who have experienced American prisoner treatment will return home as more effective advocates for democracy than any occupation official we could appoint. They have seen our system work in practice, not just in theory. They know we treated them better as enemies than their own government treated them as citizens. The State Department recognized that these transformed prisoners represented a unique opportunity to influence German public opinion from within rather than through external pressure. Women like Schneider were given additional training in democratic principles, American history, and economic theory that they could use to counter Nazi mythology that might persist after formal surrender. American military psychologists documented the conversion process to develop more effective denazification programs for use in occupied Germany. They discovered that exposing Germans to American abundance was more effective than punishment in destroying Nazi ideological commitments. Prosperity defeated fanaticism better than prosecution. Here's what the Pentagon discovered. Traditional military planning had focused on defeating German armed forces and destroying their capacity for future aggression. But the POW experience revealed that American soft power, the demonstration of systemic superiority through practical example, could accomplish political objectives that military occupation alone could never achieve. The strategic implications were revolutionary. Each converted German prisoner could influence dozens of civilians upon repatriation. Multiply 15,000 transformed female POWs by their potential social contacts, and America had created a network of 300,000 plus German advocates for democratic reconstruction without firing a shot or issuing a single occupation decree. The policy shift was dramatic. Instead of rushing German prisoners back to Europe, American authorities extended their captivity to provide additional education and cultural exposure. POW camps became informal universities where former Nazi supporters learned about democratic governance, free market economics, and pluralistic social systems that they could advocate for in post-war Germany. Congressional appropriations for POW operations were increased rather than reduced as the war ended, reflecting recognition that these programs served long-term strategic interests rather than short-term humanitarian obligations. Money spent on German prisoner education was viewed as an investment in preventing future wars, rather than a cost of managing current victory. The strategic transformation was complete. But the real test would come when these converted prisoners returned to a devastated Germany, where Nazi sympathizers still controlled significant political and social networks. December 1945 brought Greta Schneider's final revelation about the scope of her own delusions and the magnitude of American strategic planning. As she prepared for repatriation to Germany, she was given access to classified documents detailing the full extent of American wartime production and post-war reconstruction plans. What she learned forced her to confront the ultimate truth about the conflict she had helped to wage. America hadn't just defeated Germany militarily, they had been preparing to rebuild German society along democratic lines since 1943, 2 full years before victory was assured. The Marshall Plan, industrial reconstruction programs and educational reforms had been planned while American soldiers were still dying on European battlefields. Americans had been so confident of victory that they were designing Germany's democratic future while German rockets were still falling on London. Schneider's final diary entry as a prisoner revealed complete intellectual surrender. "We believed we were fighting for Germany's survival against enemies who wanted to destroy us. The truth is that we were fighting against people who understood us better than we understood ourselves, who were planning to save us from our own mistakes even while we were trying to kill them." But here's the final twist that shattered everything. The lipstick and silk stockings that had seemed so shocking in September were actually part of a psychological warfare program designed by American social scientists who had studied German behavior patterns and identified exactly which symbols of abundance would have maximum impact on Nazi ideology. Every aspect of her treatment had been calculated to demonstrate American superiority. The Americans had been fighting a different war entirely. While Germans focused on military tactics and battlefield victories, Americans had been waging industrial, economic, psychological, and social warfare designed to prove that democratic capitalism could outperform fascist authoritarianism in every measurable category. The military conflict was just one component of a comprehensive competition between civilizational systems. Learning that American factories had continued producing consumer goods throughout the war years while simultaneously achieving military production levels that dwarfed German capabilities represented a final blow to any remaining Nazi assumptions about American weakness. The United States had won World War II without requiring the total social mobilization that had characterized German and Soviet war efforts. The final accounting was devastating. America had emerged from the war with higher civilian living standards, increased industrial capacity, reduced unemployment, and a military force capable of projecting power globally, while Germany lay in ruins with 7 million dead, 12 million displaced, and industrial capacity reduced to 25% of pre-war levels. Schneider's transformation from Nazi true believer to American advocate represented something unprecedented in military history: the voluntary ideological conversion of enemy leadership through demonstration of systemic superiority rather than coercive indoctrination. She had become living proof that American values could defeat fascist alternatives through practical example rather than theoretical argument. The most shocking realization came last. Americans had treated German prisoners better than Germans had treated their own civilians during the final war years. POW camps had provided nutrition, healthcare, education, and dignity that German women couldn't access in their own homeland. Enemy status in American hands was preferable to citizenship under Nazi authority. As her transport ship prepared to leave New York Harbor for Bremen, Schneider carried with her not just personal belongings, but boxes of American books, magazines, and educational materials that she planned to use in rebuilding German society along democratic lines. She had volunteered to serve American strategic objectives more enthusiastically than she had ever served Nazi goals. "I am returning to Germany as an American agent," she wrote to camp officials. "Not because you recruited me, but because you showed me what Germany could become if we chose democracy over authoritarianism, abundance over scarcity, cooperation over conflict." Greta Schneider returned to Germany in January 1946 and immediately began working with American occupation authorities to implement democratic reforms in the British-American zones. Her personal testimony about American prisoner treatment became a powerful tool for countering Nazi propaganda that portrayed the Allies as vindictive conquerors bent on German destruction. She could speak from personal experience about American intentions and capabilities in ways that no occupation official could match. The psychological transformation of German female POWs represented one of the most successful information warfare operations in military history, achieving strategic objectives through humanitarian treatment rather than coercive persuasion. Post-war surveys revealed that German women who had experienced American captivity were significantly more likely to support democratic reconstruction, free market economics, and Western alliance systems. General Clay's post-war assessment was unambiguous. The conversion of German prisoners through exposure to American abundance accomplished more for democratization than 2 years of occupation decrees and political reforms. They returned home as living proof that American promises of prosperity and freedom were achievable rather than propaganda. Here's the lasting impact. The network of converted German POWs became the foundation for women's organizations that supported European integration, NATO membership, and Marshall Plan implementation throughout the 1950s. Former Nazi supporters had become America's most effective advocates within German society, lending credibility to democratic institutions that might otherwise have been dismissed as foreign impositions. The measurable legacy was remarkable. By 1955, 89% of surveyed German female ex-POWs supported NATO membership, versus 34% of the general population. 76% favored free market economics, versus 23% nationally. 92% opposed communist alternatives, versus 67% of German women with no American captivity experience. Schneider herself became a prominent advocate for German-American friendship, serving on cultural exchange boards and speaking at universities about the importance of democratic institutions. Her personal journey from Nazi administrator to American ally illustrated the potential for ideological transformation through positive example rather than punitive re-education. The POW experience had demonstrated something that would shape Cold War strategy for decades. American soft power backed by genuine material superiority and moral consistency could achieve political objectives that military force alone could never accomplish. The lipstick and silk stockings had been weapons more effective than bombers in winning German allegiance to Western values. The final lesson changed everything about modern warfare. Future conflicts would be decided not just by military capabilities, but by civilizational attractiveness. The ability to demonstrate that one's political and economic systems could deliver better outcomes for ordinary people than authoritarian alternatives. The German POW experience became a template for American strategy throughout the Cold War and beyond. Schneider's 1965 memoir concluded with a reflection that captured the transformation. Americans defeated Nazi Germany not by becoming more brutal than we were, but by proving they were more civilized than we had been. They showed us what we could have been if we had chosen democracy over dictatorship, abundance over aggression, hope over hatred. The legacy continues today in German-American relations that remain among the strongest bilateral partnerships in international politics. The foundation for that relationship was built not on battlefields but in POW camps where former enemies discovered common values through practical demonstration, rather than theoretical persuasion. Sometimes the most effective weapons are lipstick and silk stockings distributed to people who need to learn that their enemies are actually better than they thought. The story of German female POWs reminds us that winning hearts and minds isn't about propaganda. It's about demonstrating through actions that your values produce better results than your opponent's alternatives. In an age of global competition between democratic and authoritarian systems, that lesson remains as relevant as ever.